Corsair, Apple Floppy Days, Commodore, Tandy Floppy Days, Atari, TI Floppy Days. The weekend comes, the disk drive hums, ready to code for you. These days we're all happy and free. Those floppy days, the games we play, you shared with me. Those days, Motorola, Intel 6502, graphics and text are there to view. Composite, color, or RGB, program fun for you and me.
Floppy Days is recorded in a live studio.
Inside PC Floppy Days, SD Amiga Floppy Days, Junior Sinclair Floppy Days, Classic Days, Microwaves, geeking all week with you. These days we're all happy and free. Those floppy days, the games we play, you shared with me. Those days, these floppy days are yours and mine. These floppy days are yours and mine. Floppy days.
The TRS-80 Model I,
Introducing the Apple IIc.
Atari 1040 ST,
Commodore 64. What?
PC Junior, new from IBM.
Discover Atari. It's at his Radio Shack Color Computer 3.
Introducing the Timex Sinclair 1000.
For computer, this is the one. Texas Instruments home computer.
A wonder computer of the 1980s. The Commodore VIC-20.
Hello and welcome to episode 144 of the Floppy Days Podcast for October 2024. I am Randy Kindig, your host for this audio ode to the home computers of the past. This month, I have a special treat for you. At the recent Tandy Assembly, which I will talk about in more detail later in the podcast, not only were there a lot of great people, exhibits, vendors, and camaraderie, but we were also blessed with having Steve Leininger as one of the guest speakers, along with his partner in the development of the TRS-80 Model I, Don French. I recently had an interview with Steve Leininger, episode 142, thanks to his willingness to be interviewed at the recent VCF Southeast in Atlanta. That was a milestone for my podcast, as I had always wanted to talk with Steve. I also had interviewed Don French several years ago, prior to his attending Tandy Assembly in 2017, in episode 53. This time, however, I was able to get an interview with Don and Steve together in the same interview. That in itself was amazing, and I think you'll really enjoy the back and forth between the two gentlemen, who are obviously and correctly proud of the work they did to bring the TRS-80 to the world and Tandy into the computer business. Next month, I will talk about another computer rescue that came my way recently, and which is also tied into Tandy Assembly and Radio Shack computers. I'll not go into any further detail here, as I don't want to spoil that story for you next month, but believe me, it will be fun both to tell and to listen to. Before we go on, let's not forget to mention some of the great storefronts that support our vintage computing hobby in a big way, such as 8bitclassics.com, run by my friend Corey Colts. He has a great shop for acquiring vintage computer items like video cables, power supplies, cartridges, upgrades, and more for several vintage computer platforms. I often talk about things that I acquire from Corey at 8-Bit Classics. Check out the site, he has some great stuff. Also, there's arcadeshopper.com, run by my friend Greg McGill, another terrific site to get vintage computer items. He has a really wide variety of hard-to-find items for an amazing number of platforms. This is another site that I do and have done a lot of shopping at and mention often on Floppy Days. If anything shows out of stock, you can ping Greg through the contact form, and he can check whether he has or can get more of the item for you. And don't forget about FutureVision Research, which is a more recent vendor managed by my friend Brian Cox. If you're in need of a FujiNet for any of the official platforms, such as Apple II, Atari 8-bit, Coco, Coleco Atom, Brian has what you need. He also has some cool soldering kits for whatever skill level you're at, including beginner, and I will actually talk a little bit more about those in detail later in the podcast. I also want to mention those listeners who appreciate the show enough to donate through patreon.com. I really appreciate you guys, and it helps offset the cost of running the podcast. Regarding that, I have some tiers that I've created for paid members and have come up with ways to reward those who are generous enough to monetarily support Floppy Days on Patreon, which is at patreon.com/floppydays, such as early access to videos of interviews, such as being brought to you in audio form in this episode. Visit patreon.com to see more details concerning the rewards for supporters. I do want to mention that it is always my intention to make all content available to everyone at no cost, while at the same time providing some benefits for those generous enough to support the podcast. I hope you agree I've come up with a good compromise. Please let me know your thoughts and enjoy the rest of the podcast.
Hi, this is Steve Leininger. You might remember me as the designer of Radio Shack's TRS-80 Model I. You're listening to the Floppy Days Podcast.
Okay, now for new acquisitions and what I've been up to. I've got several things that I want to talk about, including a show and some acquisitions from the show, as well as acquisitions outside of the show. First up, a new Tandy Radio Shack acquisition. I own several of the fun and powerful Tandy color computers, namely 2 Coco 2s, and I have 2 Coco 3s. For some reason, recently, I've had a desire to acquire the Battleship Gray Coco 1 to round out the collection of Cocos. I prefer the Battleship Gray because it matches some of the other Tandy machines I have, like the Model I line. However, being realistic, I didn't want the early Coco one that had just 4K or 16K of RAM and the early color basic. I wanted an upgraded one with the full 64K and extended basic and ROM. Recently, coincidentally, a local one came up through Facebook Marketplace that met those specs. The gentleman recounted that he and his father had both gotten a Coco 1 back when they first came out, and this was one of those original machines. In the meantime, he had upgraded the basic and RAM on it, and the machine worked great. It was in the original box and included about a dozen cartridges, many of them with manuals, the rare Radio Shack cartridge holder, the RS-32 and Direct Connect modem packs, 2 sets of joysticks, the computer manuals, and a few Coco magazines. For some reason, he had issues selling it and had just reduced the price on the set. I met him at a public location and purchased the set. I'm not very happy with the video out off of this machine, and so I am looking at ways that I can upgrade or improve the video on it, such as installing a composite mod. Otherwise, I am very happy to have added this to my collection. Now I just have to find somewhere to display it. Okay, next up, some soldering kits. FutureVision Research, as I mentioned earlier, is run by Brian Cox, one of the sponsors of the podcast. As I mentioned earlier, Brian has some great soldering kits in his set of products. And I need a lot of practice in that area. I mentioned that to him, and he was kind enough to send me a few kits from what he offers. That includes the Soldering Basics Kit, which is a through-hole circuit board and 29 parts. And it has a circuit that blinks 2 LEDs back and forth. So that looks like that should be fun. There's also the BeamBot Soldering Kit, which is a learn to solder kit that helps you learn about solar power and beam robotics. It has a little robot that responds to sunlight by vibrating, and the more intense the light, the faster it vibrates. And then finally, a big one is the demonstrator soldering kit. Now, this isn't a beginner soldering kit, so I'm going to have to definitely save this for last. It's basically a learning platform that helps you understand coding, as well as the differences between discrete and microcontroller-based circuits. Requires an Arduino Nano. And the great thing is about all of these soldering kits is that Brian even has videos that he's created about each one of these kits to help you work through them. So great stuff, Brian, and I thank you very much for providing these. Okay, and then the other big thing that I have been up to, and the last thing I'm going to discuss here, is Tandy Assembly 2024. The last couple months, I discussed my recent trip to VCF Southeast in Atlanta and the great time I had here, and VCF Midwest in the Chicago area. So the Tandy Assembly show occurs in Springfield, Ohio. And before I get into the details of the show, I got a little bit of a pre-story. Leading up to the show, I had spoken with Steve Leininger at VCF Southeast about coming to Tandy Assembly. Steve actually told me that Tandy Assembly was definitely a show he wanted to attend, and he then contacted the organizers shortly thereafter and got set up to come to the show as the main speaker. Also, every year since 2017, when I got Don French to come to TA as keynote speaker after interviewing him on the podcast, I send Don an email letting him know that TA is coming up and inviting him to come to the show. So I do this every year. This year, I made a special effort to let him know that Steve was coming, hoping that would be an additional incentive for him to come. Surprisingly, shortly thereafter, he contacted me back and said he had booked his airline to come to the show. Now, I'm not coming out and saying that Steve Leininger and Don French came to TA directly because of me, but I am saying I think I had a big part in the two of them being there. Just saying. All right, on with the show. First of all, my impressions of the show. I loved it, as I always do. This is a great weekend trip for my wife and I. It's only about 2.5 hours from where I live, and thus it's a pretty easy drive. My wife likes to hit the flea markets and antique shops around Springfield, Ohio, while the show is going on. The attendance this year was about normal, with perhaps a few more exhibitors than in the past. At least it seemed that way. The Tech Talks occur on Friday, and the attendance for that and the following dinner was just about standing only. I've honestly never seen so many people attend the Tech Talks, but it's also understandable since the quality of the talks is always, and this year was no exception, are always so high. Steve Leininger was the keynote speaker, and having Don French there with him was great. There were, of course, several other speakers. There was the usual well-attended auction, and a lot of great stuff got sold to support the show. And there was a quiz show on Saturday night, although I left before that to spend the evening with my wife. As I usually do at these events, I was an exhibitor and had a single table. On one end, I had a display of Floppy Days information, stickers, and cards. On the other end of my table, I had a display with a TRS-80 Model I matching monitor and cassette drive. The display was meant as a tribute to Steve and Don being at the show as co-developers of the Model I and its announcement in 1977. I even loaded up some cassette software, although it wasn't without its problems that I'll talk about. New acquisitions at the show. There was plenty of opportunity to pick up new items, with items being sold throughout the event venue. I picked up a couple of things, one being a drive cable for the TRS-80 Model I from Ian Maverick. Now, I already had a drive cable for the two Model I drives I have, but found that it was too short to connect the drives to my Model 1 at home that's displayed on the official Tandy Model 1 desk. So before the show, I contacted Mav and told him about the problem. He built a longer one for me and threw it in a suitcase before he flew over from Australia. Thanks a lot, Mav. I really appreciate that. The other thing I picked up that I'm excited about is a RAM card for the Tandy PC2. Jeff Burt had an exhibit at TA as usual, and as usual he had a bunch of fantastic upgrades for the Tandy portables and pocket PC machines. One of the things he had there that intrigued me was a 16K flash and 16K RAM card for the Tandy Pocket PC2 / Sharp PC 1500, which are the same machines. I love my PC2. It is the most powerful of the Tandy Pocket computers, but memory cards for this platform are rare and hard to come by. This card allows the memory to be expanded by 16K and provides the ability to switch between 8 16K memory banks. Plus, there are 8 banks of non-volatile flash memory. It has battery backup using a button cell to protect the memory while the main batteries are being swapped in the machine. And they also allow the card to be moved to other machines while preserving the contents. Jeff had some other things I was eyeing and maybe new acquisitions for a future show, such as a replacement serial parallel interface for the same machine, the PC2 Sharp PC 1500, and the ability to use an SD-based interface as a virtual drive for that platform. Amazing stuff. And finally, I purchased some cassette pads, not directly at the show itself, but as a result of going to the show. And actually, I purchased them while I was at the show, and it had to do with the TRS-80 Model 1 cassettes that I was attempting to load for my exhibit. As I mentioned, I brought a cassette-based Model 1 to the show as tribute to Steve and Don and brought all the Model 1 cassettes I had. There was only one of the cassettes that I could get to load, which was Space Invaders. It turned out that every other cassette, which is probably a dozen, had the same issue. The felt pad that keeps the tape pushed against the tape mechanism had fallen off or moved. It was suggested that I get some new pads to restore those cassettes, so I found them on Amazon and ordered them while I was at the show. Hopefully, that will get these tapes working again. Also, as usual, I brought something to repair at the show. Last year it was a Model 4. The year before that it was a Model 3. And this year it was a Model 4P. This was the very 4P that I mentioned in a previous episode that blew its RIFA capacitor at VCF Southeast. Ian Maverick took a few moments to recap this machine, and I thank him very much for doing so. Now I just need to install a Fred or Gotek in the 4P. Overall, it was a very fun event, and I want to thank Pete Satinsky, Neil Blanchard, John Linville, Randy Weaver, Ian Maverick, and others for organizing this show. This is a must-do event if you like Tandy computers at all. And that's it for what I've been up to this month.
This is Ian Maverick, aka Mav, from the Trash Talk Podcast, and you're listening to the Floppy Days Podcast.
Okay, now for upcoming shows. I do want to remind everyone I've created a shared list of the upcoming shows and published it on the Floppy Days website. You can go to the link provided in the show notes here, or just use the link at floppydays.com, and you'll have access to the show list for the current year that I keep updated. Now, there's not very many shows left, in fact, only a couple for the remainder of this year that I'm aware of. By the next show, I will start including the shows that are occurring in 2025, which I don't really believe there's much in the first quarter of 2025, except maybe VCF SoCal. But I will have a list of those on the next show. So coming up yet this year, as of this recording, there is Retro Computer Festival 2024, November 9th through the 10th, at the Center for Computing History in Cambridge, England, and Silly Venture Winter Edition, December 5th through the 8th in Gdansk, Poland. And that's it for upcoming shows.
Hi, I'm Stuart Chaffee, host and executive producer of the Computer Chronicles television series. You're listening to me on the Floppy Days Podcast, hosted by Randy Kindig.
Okay, now we have the interview with Steve Leininger and Don French. They talk about how Tandy got into computers, any challenges they ran into, and how there are many things that could have gone differently that might have derailed Tandy actually getting into the computer business. I think you're going to enjoy the back and forth that these two friends and colleagues have during this interview. It makes for a lot of fun. And here we go. Hi, I'm here with Don French and Steve Leininger, who were the masterminds behind the TRS-80 Model I. And actually, as I understand it, this is the first time they've been together since, 1977, I think it was, gentlemen?
76, 77.
So we're going to talk today with them a little bit more about why Radio Shack got into the computer business to begin with and how they met and that whole interaction there. So let's start out there, if we could, and talk about the history and why Radio Shack got into the computer business to start with.
Okay. Yeah, Don French, in case you don't know. I was a Radio Shack employee starting at 16. I was the youngest salesman ever. I became a store manager at 18, the youngest store manager, and then I became the youngest executive ever at 23. And I was the product manager in the corporate office of parts and pieces, the semiconductors, resistors, all the good stuff. There were 7 buyers, product managers, and the other 1,200 items, the parts and pieces were 1,200 items, and the other 1,200 that Radio Shack sold were the radios, antennas, CBs, speakers, all that good stuff. So one of the things that got me started in it is a magazine article for the Mark 8, 74.
Mm-hmm.
I saw that and I said, wow, this is interesting. And I called a gentleman that created it and talked to him and asked how many he sold. He sold 8,000. And to me, that being a product manager, that was a great deal because about 6 months, a year earlier, I had created a new product in Radio Shack called project boards. Project boards were printed circuit boards designed to do something, but the key to Radio Shack was you build it from every part that was in Radio Shack's inventory list. And that was the whole concept behind it, just help build the inventory.
Mm-hmm.
And when I saw that Mark 8, and I built it, and I was able to make it work, I became really interested in it. And then the next year, Altair came out, MITS came out with the Altair, and I bought one of those. And I built that one up and actually used it in managing my 1,200 items. Because we did what was called a one of a kind, at least once a year and sometimes more. It was, it took on a columnar pad, stock number, wholesale price, retail price, do them all, add them all, or take them up, add them up, and then you get what your one of a kind gross margin is. That was our standard to work from. And that was a PIA to do with 1,200 items.
Yeah.
With the other ones, they had 200 and 300 each. So it was nothing. And so I was doing it that way. And then once I built the Altair, I had really built it up. I've got an ICOM disk drive, floppy disk drive, 7-inch floppies. I had a deck writer and an ADM3 turbo. And I wrote a basic program to do my one-of-a-kinds, keep my inventory, basically, so I could just press a key and say, run the report, and it would print it out for me. And I taught my now ex how to do it. And she could, if I needed anything during the day, she knew how to look up an inventory item for me. And that worked very well. And the first time I turned in that report taught me a lot about acceptance of the computer. I turned it into, I won't give her a real name, but she was nicknamed Dragon Lady, who was the rebuyer. In other words, the person responsible for buying restock to keep what we put in as product managers in the product line to put that out and keep us in inventory. And I took it to her and handed it to her, and she looked at it and said, "What's this?" And I said, "It's my one of a kind." She handed it back to me with a columnar pad and said, "Do it right." In other words, hand copy it. I did. It was the worst writing of my life, I'm positive. But it told me that getting anybody to accept computing was going to be a nightmare. Mm-hmm. And that was the first experience with it. But I didn't give up. I started working on it, and then kept pushing and pushing and pushing, talking about it. Zero interest.
Zero interest within Radio Shack?
Within Radio Shack.
Yeah.
Nobody was interested in it. And then we, as product managers, we had to work 5.5 days a week since the stores were open 6. We worked Saturday mornings also. And we were in this was in 76, because I had the Altair. One Saturday, rumors started going around the office. Tandy's coming in on the warpath. Oh, and we dreaded those. He called all the product managers together in the conference room, and he started in on the warpath. Advent had just released a really high-tech speaker system. And he said, "Why can't Radio Shack be innovative?" And I listened, because mine are parts and pieces. And, one of the other product managers said, "Don's got a computer in his office." Gee, thanks. I did. I ended with the Adium 3. I moved it in there, and so I could do it myself. And so Tandy just said, "So?" Didn't care about it, and so nobody did. Bernie Appel was my boss, direct boss, vice president of marketing. John Roach, vice president of manufacturing. No interest whatsoever, even though he was also head of IT, the computer center. I keep forgetting that we didn't have IT back then.
Right.
And no interest whatsoever. And there was a lot of interest in calculators, watches, digital electronics, but there's nothing for a computer. No interest at all. And I was trying to talk them into it. And so when they did the project board, started working on doing it, because I knew I controlled what was in that product line. I didn't have to get approval of Bernie Appel or anybody, because they didn't care, honestly. It was sales, it was working, and it was just running. And so, but I am not, even though I'm a ham operator, amateur license, I know electronics, I can do stuff like that, no digital work whatsoever in my life. But I was working with all the major vendors of semiconductors and processors, and that AMD, National were the primary ones I was working with, and Radio Shack didn't want it, so I was free to talk about it, and I did. I talked to a gentleman named Chuck Bettel. You may know that name.
Oh yeah.
He was AMD, and he was creator of the Commodore and the BET. And so I had some long talking to him about it, what I felt the product was. I was going to try to get him to build something for me that I could use, and it didn't happen that way. But I described it to him exactly what it was, even to the extent of the keyboard I described was a microwave keyboard. Microwave, the touch. Can't make a mess of them because it's all plastic covered. And they were cheap. And it didn't describe the boxy look of it. They didn't describe it at all because they didn't care. But it also had the cassette player built into because that was the storage at that time. And that's what I described to him. And then we talked about buying the AMD chip, and they didn't do it. And I talked to National. They were one of my primary suppliers. Their National Semiconductor sales rep, he was pushing it. He knew what I wanted to do, and he started getting the technical people at National to start making proposals to me about how to do it and to create a design of a project board using everything that I had in my line and their SCAMP initially chip, and then ultimately looked at doing the PACE also, which are Microsoft, National Semiconductor processors, the two they had at the time. And still didn't get any interest from anybody. I was working on it. Never got to turn in a computerized one of a kind either. Still had to do it by paper next year too. It was crazy. And I was making trips out to California quite often because we bought a lot of surplus electronics. And I planned the trips around the computer fair. And so I got to go out there, and there's one day in 76 early that was out there and at the show, and Roach had come out to see, do a buying trip or for the chips. I don't know, it was Fairchild and National. I don't know who else he was seeing. I wasn't with him at all. And I asked him, say, hey, you want to come to the computer show with me? And he looked at his schedule and said, yeah, I'd love to. And there was McCormick Center in San Francisco, huge complex. The line going in was around the complex totally. It took an hour standing in line to get in there. And I said, oh, this is going to destroy any chance. And we got in, and he was shocked about the number of people in there asking questions, looking at everything in there, the high interest level in computing.
Yeah.
And after he went and got back to Fort Worth and wrote a memo to Charles saying that there is something to this computing. Anyway, he sort of became interested in it. And then I wasn't out in California on the next time it came up, and he was out at National. And I knew that he was going to ask about it because he asked my contacts there who was working with me. And I didn't know what was going to happen. He asked about it at the end of their meeting about the watch and calculators. He asked, what do you know about the personal computers? And it was told, this is hearsay to me because I wasn't there, but what he said is that they said, we have somebody that can talk to you about it intelligently, and he said, bring him in. And Steve came in.
Yeah, actually, they were going to have their, we had a sales manager at National Semiconductor, Phil Roybal, and he was otherwise occupied that day. I had no idea what he was doing.
You just got lucky that day.
He wasn't there.
Yeah.
And so they said, well, Steve knows as much about the SCAMP microprocessors. I couldn't talk pricing or anything.
Yeah, it wasn't about pricing, it was about concepts.
Yeah, and so they had me come in, and actually I was the right person for that because I had been going to the monthly Homebrew Computer Club meetings, the same place where Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak also were going. Mm-hmm. And we were all just engineers then. There are any superstars in the room. It was, Lee Felsenstein, who was actually the moderator for the Homebrew Computer Club. We had some star power there. The guys from Krememco, Bob Marsh from Processor Technology. You know, so it was the beginnings of things. The guys who did IMSCI, the IMSCI was like an Altair with a real power supply in it.
Good description.
And better switches.
Yeah.
So, and I was building a computer at home, and I was also very familiar with the software for the low-cost microprocessor that Radio Shack was selling, and I was doing a BASIC for that. You know, so it was.
Do you ever think what might have happened though if you hadn't actually been there that day?
Don't know what would have happened.
I mean, yeah.
Well, and there was more than one part to that because, you know, I told them, you know, some different things and all that, and it was Jack Sellers and John Roach, and
Jack Sellers, that was the head of development.
They did the project kits. That group did the project kits for Don.
Yeah, they didn't design it. They did anything that was assembled. They didn't do any of mine. They didn't even know what I was doing. I had a board made. They made the board.
Okay.
Because we had our own board making plant.
Mm-hmm.
So they made the boards,
Mm-hmm.
but they were designed by somebody else. I did have a few of the engineers design a couple of them, like the digital clock.
Yeah.
Designed by Radio Shack Tech Editions. But that's all they did. They did not make anything other than they pressed the boards.
So, one of the things Mr. Roach asked about was, are there any one of those newfangled computer stores in the area? And it so happened that I was moonlighting at Byte Shop number 2, the second of Paul Terrell's legendary computer stores.
He didn't tell him that.
Anyway, but they asked where.
Oh, it was. And I found you there.
Yeah. And I said, well, yeah, you go down here and go down here, and you'll find the store. And well, not only did they, you know, they went to dinner and then they went out on an excursion, and well, they found me in the store. I was in there rolling up a paper tape when they came in, you know. So it's kind of like he's here, there, and everywhere. And they looked around the store, and you know, kind of checked things out. And there wasn't anything that was like a traditional computer there yet. You know, I mean, you know, it was still the Altair kind of box. They had a couple different versions. The original Apple, the big cookie sheet,
no
became
cases or
known as the
anything.
model
Boards.
Apple
Hobbyist.
One. Yeah,
The Apple One? Apple One?
Apple One. Yeah. You know, there were a few of those, and this cookie sheet printed circuit board sold for $666.66.
Yeah.
And you know, you still had to add a keyboard to it, had to add a monitor to it.
Right.
So it wasn't the same kind of thing. You know, even the we sold the M-Size, which were the high horsepower S100 bus, the Altair kind of equivalent.
Right.
And so anyway, they looked around, and Jack Sellers said, would you consider consulting on a project that we're working on? Because they knew enough about Don's project to know that it hadn't moved forward. Okay. And so I said, yeah, I'd consider that. So I didn't hear from him for 6 weeks. And then I get a call Saturday morning saying, we'd like you to come out and see our facilities. And interesting thing about that is consultant doesn't really care what your facility looks like.
Yeah.
You know, and so that was kind of like, that was a HR speak that they wanted to hire me, you know. Yeah. Well, my wife had been working the breakfast shift at McDonald's, and she had a degree in marine geology. Couldn't get a job in the Bay Area. She calls her cousin, and who's a VP at Conoco, says, "What are the chances of finding a job in the Dallas-Fort Worth area?" He said, "Oh, they're way better for you than in the Bay Area." And so I called back and said, "I need to bring my wife out to check things out also." And basically unheard of at Radio Shack. I mean,
unheard of totally.
Yeah, well, they had 3,500 company stores, and so when they bring people in, they weren't bringing people in and their wives; they're just bringing in the store manager kind of thing.
Yeah. We had an annual meeting of all the managers, and so that would be a lot of wives traveling.
Yeah,
very, very expensive.
So Jack said, "Well, I'll have to get back to you now," and so he got back and said, "Okay, we'll do that." And I don't know what the decision process was behind that, but I think I seem to know more about where the computers might be going than anyone else they'd ever talked to. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so that's when we got invited to come to Fort Worth.
Yeah, but at that time, what happened in the interim is they told me about you.
Yeah.
And they wanted me to interview you because they couldn't interview you.
Yeah.
They didn't know what to ask. Right. And that's what it was. Yeah. They did not have any idea whether it was good or bad. Uh-huh. They knew what he was talking about or anything else. He knew way more than I did about the designing of it, which is fine. I didn't care. But I was talking about, I did enough to know what needs to be done. Uh-huh. And so when he came in, I met with him, and we spent all day that day, I know, together. I don't remember how many days you stayed, but when we got done, we did become good friends at that point. And I said, he's the one to hire. And they didn't give me any argument whatsoever. They just did it.
Yeah, so they took us to lunch at a real nice place, and Mr. Roach said, "Well, we'd like to give you an offer." Yeah. And it turns out the offer was like 20% more than I was making at National.
Yeah, that's significant.
At a higher price area.
Certainly the Bay Area was even then hugely expensive.
Yeah.
And Texas has no income tax. Yep. Ding, 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 ding. So it all worked out pretty well. Yeah. And it met the possible requirements for my wife finding a job, which she ended up with a 30-some-odd year career in the petroleum business, which also pays money. And
that's interesting.
Yeah, so the interview was basically talking about computers and everything. And
say, what kind of question did you ask in that interview?
I kind of remember now.
Well, I think it was more talking about if you were going to build a computer, what would you do?
Yeah, and generic type.
And I think the hope was that I was going to be able to save this PACE project that they had gotten started, the 16-bit microprocessor, and it took me 2 months to figure out that, boy, where that was going just wasn't going to go anywhere. Mm. And
it was still going to be a project board, though.
Yeah.
That did not change yet.
Yeah, so it was going to be a project board, which was a kit.
Right.
Right. And because he would have put whatever microprocessor I'd ended up
in the line.
In the line.
Right.
And the problem is that you have to meet a certain level of work. We decided it needed to have some kind of display on it. Liquid crystals weren't, available then and all that. Yeah. So it was going to hook to a TV somehow. Mm-hmm. And I knew some stuff based on work that I'd already been doing. I was making a glass teletype at home, when I was in the Homebrew Computer Club, making a terminal basically, built into the computer, and so in the middle of this, one of these project boards came back. That
the clock.
Yeah, it was a clock.
It was the most expensive project board to build that we had, like $40 or something like that to build it. It was a great seller. A popular one too.
But you had to buy, 6, 7 segment displays, the LED displays, plus the drivers, plus the resistors, plus the
everything,
timekeeping stuff, and everything. And we got one back. We were pretty generous about using our engineering time to actually respond to customer problems on these
technical
things.
Problems.
Yeah, and so they sent the thing in, and the board wasn't much bigger than this little notebook here, but the box was suspiciously heavy, and he pulled the engineer pulled it out and he looked at it and he turns the thing over. And there was a sheet of solder over the entire bottom of the board. Someone had figured out how to put 1/8 of an inch.
I don't know how they did it.
Wow, it took a lot of solder too.
And then they went back and read the instructions. It says, insert all the components, turn the thing over, and solder everything to the bottom of the board. And somehow, it was one big slab. And at that point, Lou Kornfeld, who was president of Radio Shack, said, "It's not gonna, we're not gonna have any computer kits." Pretty well drove the wooden stake through the heart at that point, which was actually a super good idea.
It was a good idea. Yeah, that wasn't my ultimate goal, though. That was a way to get something in the company so I could move it into a real computer.
So,
my first offer as a kit, you mean?
Yeah, do the first as a project board because I controlled the project boards.
Yeah.
I didn't have to get permission from anybody to do it.
I didn't realize that's why you originally went down that path, was because you didn't have to have higher up permission.
Exactly.
But during this time, Don and I would talk back and forth, and I said, if you've got this board with board and memory, I said, what are you going to do with it? We said, well, I've got an Atom 3, which was $1,000. $999. It was a CRT monitor, glass teletype, basically. And we sold National Semiconductor sold boards that would plug into that, the RS-232, and then you do debugging. You could do some crude programming and all that, but you really couldn't do anything with it, and you still needed this $1,000 thing. I said, we need to figure out how to put a display on this as part of it. And at the same time, Don had included into the line a really nice keyboard that he got in his surplus.
A lot of the stuff, majority of the parts, pieces, everything, were surplus. They may not have made full spec, but they were their sub-spec, but they were valid. I wouldn't put them on something going to the moon. It wasn't for that, though. It was for hobby.
Yeah, and so we already had a nice feeling keyboard that one of the other guys was making a keyboard interface for him. By the time you got done with it, you'd spent $100 at a Radio Shack store, making a keyboard, which back in that time frame actually made a lot of sense. But it wasn't a computer, and I said, this computer that you guys have been working with National on isn't the one you want. I talked him off that ledge, and he said, well, what do you think it should have? And I said, well, I'd already been working on Tiny Basic for using Lai Chen Wang's Tiny Basic. I've been working on one for National Semiconductor. I said, what you probably need is BASIC built into the computer. You need enough memory to run the thing. You need a display. And the popular thing at the time was a cassette interface to do loading things. But the Tarbell, which was the big one at the time, cassette interface for the MITS computer, the Altair computer, was a $295 item by itself.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
You know, so every time you look at, if you start looking at all the numbers, you're over $1,200
Exactly.
before you had something working.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, you know, and I was told, well, we had to sell this thing for $199.
Yeah. No. The first part, it didn't have to have a monitor in that. The computer itself had to be $99.
Oh, okay.
Okay. It could have add-ons to it.
Sure.
There was
Like a cassette.
the cassette. It was cassette because there were no floppies.
Yeah.
At that time, and so that's what we were building is a $99 computer, and that's why there's no uppercase.
Right.
And so it got to be increasingly difficult to do something like that. So I started refining some design work I'd done for my machine. Let's use less memory. If you're doing 80 character lines and 24 lines, you have to have a really good monitor to do that.
Right.
You can't just use a TV.
Right.
So it was, all right, what can we do and put it on a TV? We already had a video game, right? We had a Pong equivalent game, right? And so we started looking at, all right, what's the lowest common denominator computer you can do? And it would have been using a RF modulator, a radio frequency modulator, to go to channel 3, channel 4, just like an old video game. And some version of Don's microwave oven keyboard.
Yep.
But
keyboard.
But we had this other keyboard.
We had another keyboard.
Yeah. So why don't we use your nicer keyboard? And we were still, buying surplus-ish kind of stuff. So it would have been a sold out when gone kind of thing, which is a horrible way to run a business. Yeah. But when they pulled the kit rug out from under us because of that one clock, all right, what's our fallback position? What do we do? And well, what if we take this really nice keyboard and you can kind of clack around on it? There was a lot of, it felt good. And I said, and I know you can do basic because I've done it before.
Yeah, do that.
And a certain amount of memory. And memory was kind of complicated because it was pretty expensive, except that dynamic RAMs were much less expensive for the same amount of memory.
Yeah, the old static RAM.
Right,
which was the common. And dynamic was new, and it was horrible.
Well, it was used in the mainframe, so it was less expensive. And it turned out that there was a new chip on the block at that time. The 8080 was used in the Altair and several other things. The 8085 was coming out, which is a 5-volt only version. Big plus because your power supply is less complicated. But the Z80 came out, and it was 5-volt only. It had some extra registers, which you could make an argument for could be useful. But it also had logic built into it that would automatically update it would refresh, as we call it, the dynamic RAMs.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and that became very important to the design. Otherwise, you'd have to have extra parts to do that.
It's more expensive to do it any other way.
And so this particular chip, they were pretty interested in working with us. It was designed by Zilog, but Mostech, which was in northern Dallas, Carrollton actually, what was their foundry? It was Zilog's foundry for the chip, and they could also co-produce it. Back then, it was important to be able to have multiple sources on things in case one company, lost the recipe.
Sure. Yeah.
Even though it was just one company that had the recipe. So that chip allowed us to use larger RAM. We could put in 4K of RAM, which was a huge amount at the time.
Then it was a huge amount.
The Altair only came with 256 bytes of memory.
Yeah.
And then had memory cards, a 4K memory card had 4 rows of memories. And cost $200 or $300 just for memory. So we were able to get that crushed down. And by the way those parts work, with a couple jumpers, you could use either 4K or 16K RAMs in there. So now we've got a path to
get to
doing something pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And so the rest was, all right, well, what else can you do? So I talked about moving the video around a little bit, and we talked about cassette interfaces, and the Tarbell stuff was pretty well described. You don't have to do it all in hardware. You can do a lot of that in software, it turns out, which I did, yeah. And so we made a prototype, and in fact, they moved me out of the way of other engineering so that I wouldn't be given other duties and everything. It put me off in a hidden area.
He went out to the stockyards.
Yeah, to Tandy Audio. Where they built the speakers, I was in my own little room. They had an extra room up there.
Tandy was all over Fort Worth.
Yeah, so it was kind of, I was kind of a mysterious guy, and ended up building a video card, a memory card, a microprocessor card, and probably one other card. And we had these cards, and they were built on Radio Shack format prototyping cards, hand wire wrapped. I did the wire wrapping on it from my schematics, and using Don's computer as a development system. We
for developing.
Yeah, I brought it in for
right in the base.
This thing, the cost of this thing, besides personnel, to do this was really, really cheap. They didn't buy any development software, any development equipment.
I've heard somewhere between 100 to 150,000 total.
Way too high.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. Well, that would have been
$1,000.
That would have been an all-in price, including the guys
who's manufacturing and all of it.
I mean, you had salaries and stuff in there too.
I said without that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so on Groundhog Day in 1977, I'd started working there on in 76, the day after Independence Day. We got into town on the 3rd. I started work on the 5th, and didn't really do a whole lot for the first 2 months because we were trying to figure, sort things out and everything. Mm-hmm. Kind of got my marching orders somewhere. Must have been October-ish is when we decided not a kit, and oh my gosh, we need to do something here, And so the target was that in February we're going to demonstrate this stuff, and they contracted someone to actually write the software underlying the machine. But for the demo purposes, I had to do all the software. Turns out, in the end, I had to do all the software anywhere because the guy we contracted ghosted us, disappeared. And so when we demonstrated it, it was these boards in a card rack with a wire-wrapped backplane stuck under. We had a curtain on it. So we had a table with basically a curtain on it.
But it had the keyboard in the final case.
In a thing that looked like the
final case. Yeah. It looked like it.
So
and it had
the plastic guys we used, they had a model maker that could make a looks like.
It looked like it was.
Yeah. And this is before 3D printing or anything crazy like that. So this was just flat pieces of plastic glued together and then painted Mercedes silver to match the TV. And so we had a mock-up that looked just like the Model 1. Mm-hmm. But it had integer basic in it. It only had 2K bytes 2K bytes that was scanning the keyboard, doing the cassette interface, and a full working basic, and the video. So 2K bytes.
So it wasn't even the 4K ROM.
Well, it didn't have floating point.
Okay.
It didn't have floating point, and that came up, almost killed it.
Yeah.
It almost killed it because I wrote a little program I call it H&R Shack. It was a 1040, simple. It asked for income. It calculated based upon, it didn't take deductions or anything. It took the calculation of how much it was, and it took used the tax rate for that, and calculated for it.
And so Mr. Tandy comes up there and says, enter your income. So he
100,000 put in.
Yeah, he put in 100,000, which was low. But it was only good to 32,000.
Yeah, what I told him was, Charles, take a pay cut. 32,000 is the maximum amount right now. We know it needs to improve that, but this is just a proof of concept. And he did put 32,000 in even, and it all worked.
And it worked. So after he blew a big ball of smoke at it, they said, okay, let's go ahead and do this.
Yeah, we moved over to the conference. This was in the conference room.
Yeah,
and we moved over to the conference table. Charles Tandy, Lou Kornfeld, John Roach, Steve, and me.
That was it?
That was it. That was the only people who knew about it.
Mm-hmm.
And we moved it over to the conference table. And Steve and I hadn't talked about this number at all. Didn't even come up between us. And something, it was Charles, I'm sure, said, how many can we sell? We both said at I think the same time, 50,000. And
they just laughed. To which John Roach said, "Oh shit!" And this is actually, they asked me about this when Mr. Roach passed away, and it's in his obituary in the Wall Street Journal. They quoted it. Not everyone will quote.
Did they say who gave them the quote? Did they have your name in there?
Oh yeah,
okay.
yeah. And so, it was Mr. Roach that actually said that. But it was because we'd been asked. We were asked to give our numbers.
Yeah.
And anyway, we were pessimistic as it turned out. Because
their number was 1,000. That was their number. That's what they wanted to do. When they rejected our number, they said, "Well, like 1,000." You got to remember, this was being done as a publicity stunt to prove that Radio Shack could be creative.
So as soon as we were given the green light there, they took, luckily I was pretty efficient and very complete on my design. They were able to take that and start laying out the printed circuit board for it.
Right off the bat, right with what you had.
Yeah.
In there.
And about a week or two later, after not being able to find the ghosting Bob Uterick. If you're out there, Bob.
I'm not going to say who, but Bob.
Yeah. So I ended up, basically, I was told by about 3 different people that, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope. I had to write I had to
add floating point.
Yeah, I had to add floating point. I had to add cassette data, read and write.
Yep.
I think I had the line graphics already in there. So
yeah.
But basically, you took it to 4K with all those extra.
It ended up being 4K bytes, but 4K bytes is still remarkably small for what the program did.
It added a ROM though, because that's why the way BASIC was and everything was in that ROM. We still had 4K of memory, basically.
Yes.
Approximately.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, when he got done with it, he did it. I know it was be funny, but he said, "We got 4 bytes left," and he said, "What do you want? A disk operating system?"
Yeah. What else can I fit in?
Yeah, right. I said, no, and he suggested, "Well, put our initials in it." I don't know if he did or not. And I don't know. It didn't matter to me. But we stuffed as much into that as possible to make it a complete system, because that was the goal that we had decided it had to be an absolutely standalone complete system. We missed the $99. The computer came out at $199. And the monitor could not.
That's still remarkable.
It totally blew the market away.
Yeah.
And John Shirley, that name should be familiar. He became the president of Microsoft. That he was a vice president of Radio Shack in Europe, equivalent of Bernie Appel, my boss. One of the things that I had to do as reporting is I had to report to him what I was working on, just so he was aware, so he could plan for it in his product. And I wrote him on telex, which we did every day for both Europe and our buyers in Asia. And I said, computing is our next big area. And I'd like to keep you informed of what I'm doing and what we're doing. He wrote me back at telex and said, Radio Shack can't sell the computers. Don't waste my time. And he was absolutely 100% correct. Radio Shack could not sell computers. They would buy them, people would buy them, but they could not sell them. They did not know how to sell them. And we announced it August 3rd, 1977 at the Warwick Hotel, day of the bombing of the tower.
Yeah, there was some terrorist.
The Puerto Rican liberation.
Something or bombing of it.
And it was the Exxon building, actually.
Yeah, and so
were both of you there at that?
I was.
You were? Okay.
Yeah, I was at the Warwick.
Okay.
And
but then
you were.
Yeah.
And then I went to Boston after that. I took our total production run of computers.
All three.
to the Boston Computer Fair.
Yeah.
And set it up in there, and I was totally swamped. I mean, there were 5-6 people deep trying to see it. And I used to say I was interviewed by all the networks. Well, all was 3.
Yeah.
At that
pretty
time.
much all there was at the time, yeah.
And it hit the press, and when I got back to Fort Worth, the phones wouldn't work. No phones in that office would work.
Because they'd overloaded the system.
Yeah. That's when every call was on copper wire. They couldn't then multiplex it. And so nothing. And so they finally got things fixed, and we were swamped with calls. We didn't have any to sell, but we were swamped with calls.
Yeah.
They moved me out of my office. It's a nice office, 10 by 12, something like that. It was a nice size office. Into the conference room, and the conference room became my office. And brought in an admin for me. And I took all the calls, because the only other one that company that knew anything about the computer. And I knew enough about the marketing of it and all that and what's out there. And so I told customers that I'm sorry, Radio Shack doesn't have them. We missed on the production schedule. I didn't tell them how much it was, but we missed on it. And you have 3 choices. If you want a computer right now, you can get one. It's not from us. It's an Apple. It's $2,100.
Yeah.
And but they do have some. I checked to make sure they did. The other one you can get is a Commodore PET. They have some also, and it's $900. But by the way, that was also my concept. And some went to them. The Apple, it saved them from bankruptcy because they were bankrupt at the time.
Oh, I didn't know that. So,
yeah, they were not filed.
I was wondering just how much by you doing that, how much that increased their business.
Totally. It saved them.
Because you made some awareness of personal computers.
But they sold 7,900 the first year. Not a big number, but without the TRS-80, it would have been a huge number. That would have been a very, very big number. And so that's what they sold. It kept us, and we sold some, but there was a 6-month wait in most of it. And we sold them. And Charles passed away before we really got into production, but we had sales. The sales were huge. I mean, CB radio was 40% of our business previous year.
Yeah.
It went to 5% of our business in that next year. Computers were 0 and went to 40%.
Wow.
And
that fast.
Yeah. It was the most expensive product that Radio Shack had ever sold.
It was the most expensive product in Radio Shack's history.
And we made Radio Shack's traditional high margin on it.
Yeah, we did.
And we learned a lot about manufacturing. We didn't, our manufacturing people do good work, but they didn't understand the level of, the complexity of it. We ended up making PCs later on for companies like Panasonic and DEC, Digital Equipment.
Because we had a great manufacturing line. And these were all U.S. made.
Yeah.
Nothing was sent offshore. It was made in Fort Worth.
And until the PC became a commodity. And at that point, it was, we could buy the whole populated motherboard offshore for less than we could have bought just the connectors.
Yeah.
At that point you go,
but we assembled here, though.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. We did the final
here,
but we got the motherboards in.
Yeah.
So
it saved Radio Shack because with a dropping CB business as it did, they would have had a major reduction in sales volume, and so that had an impact. I reminded Charles of that one Saturday.
But it was interesting how remarkably close, the Apple II, the Commodore PET, and the Radio Shack Model I, actually the Radio Shack TRS-80.
Yeah, right.
It didn't become a Model I until the Model II.
Same as it wasn't an Apple one then.
Yeah,
it was an Apple computer. It wasn't an Apple I. It was an Apple computer.
So anyway, but they all came out within weeks of each other.
Yeah.
And they all had their strengths and weaknesses. The case for the Apple was a superior design, but the whole thing cost a whole lot more. You didn't have a monitor that matched it at the time. Ours was what it was. It was all in one with a monitor, modified TV. Okay.
We didn't use RF. We never used RF.
We never used RF.
It was hardwired.
Yeah, and it's because we tried it both ways, and when you have control over the monitor, you get a better picture than doing it over.
So you could do 64 characters.
Yeah. And so right place, right time, and
well, the store itself was a huge benefit.
Having 3,500 stores.
That's what made it. That's the reason there's a computer industry today.
Yeah.
Because without that, nobody would have gotten the acceptance of it. It took Radio Shack to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And because it was put in the stores, it was force-fed into them, and then did something else right after that. Became aware that Tandy became more interested in the corporation and Tandy himself. And so once I had hired another product manager to take the computer, partially of it off my back, I opened up what was called Tandy Computer Center. That's what it opened as. It became Radio Shack Computer Center. But it was a market test facility. Market, we would put out there and everything in there. How did it sell? What were people asking for?
Yeah, and at the same time, we started working on the Model 2.
Yeah.
And the Model 2.
So that was the next project that you worked on?
Yeah, and we had the color computer that was also a project at that time. It was an upgrade to a thing that AgVision. We worked with Motorola on providing. AgVision was basically what was that, teletext? It used. They still do some of that stuff in Europe with a thing called the Fritz box. But so the idea was it was going to replace phone books and stuff like that in Europe. But the version in the U.S. was being used for the farmers.
Right.
A special channel for them to get the information they need. And so the color computer was an upgrade to that. The Model 2 was our first shot at a business machine. As we got a little more sophisticated on the software, it put Wang out of business. Wang was very popular word processing system at the time, and we used the economy of scale to
Yeah, but the Model 2, I left before the Model 2 came out.
Okay, I was going to ask you, but you were involved in the project before?
Just the beginning of it.
Yeah.
And what had happened, Tandy had promised me, when I saw him at the time and told him that I saved Radio Shack, that CB died and the computer just turned off. He promised me a large bonus and a vice presidency.
And then he died.
And I went to see Kornfeld to get it. And his comment to me was, no young punk, his words, is going to be a vice president of this company and make that much money. I excused myself and said, we'll talk later. But I don't get mad like that and just fly off the handle. I went to my office, cleaned the office out. Nobody knew this was going on. I cleaned it out. Talked to Bill Gates, because we had hired him to do the basic, because the Model 1 basic needed, when he started doing business stuff, even on the Model 1, we needed that what we call level 2 basic. Now it's Microsoft Basic. It was written for, it was not written, it was highly modified for us.
Right.
And so our software, our programs we wrote would run on it. And that's the reason IBM went to Microsoft to get the same exact basic.
It turned out to be a very powerful basic.
It was a very powerful basic.
Yeah.
It was very powerful, and they wanted it because we had so many computers out there. They were finally allowed to come in because they wouldn't own the market. And that's why the Justice Department allowed them to do a computer.
IBM.
Justice Department allowed IBM to do a computer. And Radio Shack screwed up. I don't know how this happened, but they screwed up and went to the interrupts on the Model 1 were a problem because you couldn't run CP/M easily, and so that was a problem. We had to use TRS-DOS, the TRS-DOS, and it was so one. But the MS-DOS was good. When IBM came out, Radio Shack, I was told, this is hindsight, that my brother was a store owner at that point and franchisee. And the information I got is that, it's the same, but IBM software does not run on Radio Shack. Radio Shack's version does not run on IBM. And so I don't know, I never tested it because I never bought a Radio Shack IBM compatible computer because it wasn't compatible. And but that was the beginning of the downfall of Radio Shack. That and they changed who they were trying to hire as a president. Kornfeld left. Roach took over. And then I don't know the person's name, but he was a executive from CBS. In other words, they got away from people who knew what they were doing. And that it went on for years, and it just kept dropping. And that was the downfall of Radio Shack. They cut their own throat, basically.
Most of that stuff happened after I left, too.
Yeah, it was way after I left.
So you left, you said, in what year was it you left?
78.
78 you left. And you said you never even said goodbye to Steve.
I didn't.
You left, right?
Yeah.
I talked to him afterwards.
What's the matter? Don't you love me anymore?
We talked afterwards because
we talk occasionally because someone...
S100 bus for it.
Yeah.
I had to do a S100 plug into the back of the TRS-80, and it would make it an S100 computer.
Oh, okay.
And I have that board, so.
So it was after the fact you found out that he had left.
Well, news travels real quick. You say, did you hear about Don? I said, well, no. He says, he's not there anymore. Yeah. But there was no story that went with it. He's not there anymore. So it's like any other. It's like a murder mystery. You don't know whether he went crazy. I mean, people don't go crazy anymore, of course. And we're talking from Springfield, Ohio, right now.
Right. Right. I'll clear the air of what happened. After Kornfeld told me no young punk's going to be a vice president coming up, and I talked to Bill, he offered me a job. I turned him down. I decided I was going to do it myself. I went back to see Kornfeld. And before I could even get in his office...
How did that work out?
What's that?
How did that work out?
He said, if you hear about the bonus and the promotion, the answer is still no. I'm going to keep it really clean from what I said. It wouldn't have
I have nothing to say.
I said, basically, I looked at him, turned to leave, looked back at him and said, do something to yourself that's impossible.
Oh, yeah.
I did, and was walked out. Didn't turn back. I burned the bridges on purpose. I was not going back, but I told myself, well, if they wanted me, they would have to pay through the nose.
Yeah.
It would be not just a large bonus; it'd be an extremely large bonus, and a contract because I don't trust them. Well, I didn't go back. I started my own business, doing CPM for the TRS-80. That's what I did, and of course that was a problem. I had to change with Gary Kildall all of the interrupts because we couldn't use the low interrupts because we were using them in the computer.
No, right.
And so that wouldn't work. But I did that and sold very, very well. It's what I was able to do to start my business. And switched to healthcare in '83 and been doing healthcare since then.
Let's see. Okay.
But it's been, and there are a lot of things in the whole history that could have stopped it from being ever existing. I joined the Navy at 17. I wanted my college paid for. And the only way to do that was to military. And so I did it. My high school girlfriend's dad was the recruiter that got me in. And I went to boot camp. There was a special program they did. You could go to boot camp between your junior and senior year. I went as a radioman because I went in as an E3. I didn't know enough about analyzing at that point, and I could have been a deadly mistake. Marines don't have radiomen or corpsmen. They use Navy radiomen and corpsmen. You travel on foot with the Marines. And with a radioman with a sign over your head saying shoot here. The antennas back then were 4 or 5 feet tall. I could have been easily killed. But I got out. The commander got me out because I screwed my knee up back again in high school, and so they said, we don't want you. But it kept me out. That's one thing that could have ended it right there. Never happened. I wouldn't have been at Radio Shack. And then at Radio Shack, that's already happened. I applied for a job after I was a disc jockey for a couple of years, and then I was going to an AM station, and I applied for a job temporarily at Radio Shack for Christmas. And I saw a store manager, and he said, yeah, I'll be glad to hire you. Went in the next day, he said he'd have an application, and I told him, I filled it out, and he saw I was 16, and he said, oh, I can't hire you. When you're older, come back. We're glad to. Well, I went the next day. He was gone. He was actually promoted to another store. The new manager there saw the representation. He says, I'll hire you right now. And so I got on there. The same thing happened going to Fort Worth. I was turned down by Bernie Appel. He said I needed 5 more years in the store. 4 months later, I met him again at a regional meeting. Had my 5-year pin on, and they asked, 5 years? I said, no, 7. He asked if I would be interested in if I knew anything about electronics, and I told him, ham operator, and I've done some work. And he asked me to come to Fort Worth. If I hadn't done that, wouldn't be a computer.
Yeah.
And if I hadn't been as committed to doing it, I was totally committed because of an issue that through elementary school that I was not taught properly. Let's just put it that way. I wasn't dyslexic or anything. I just was bored, and so they did not teach me properly. I didn't learn to read until the 4th grade, and they told me I'd never go to college. They were going to put me in industrial arts in high school. I said I'm going to college, and because I was committed. In my mind, I knew I was going. And then I had to sign, or my mother had to sign also an agreement with the school saying that when I didn't graduate from high school, not if, but when I didn't graduate from high school, I couldn't sue them. And I accepted that. I knew I was going to graduate. I graduated in 3.5 years. but again, I was committed, and that's where it was with this. Mm-hmm. I was committed totally to this, and after the 1,000 projection that they made, and we were working on it, we were going down that line. Kornfeld came to me and said, "We've upped the production run, 4,500. Since we have 4,000 stores, when the product fails, not if." They did not believe in it yet. We want to use it for inventory control, and I talked to our computer group about it, and they said, yes, we can. I wanted to tell them something, again, profanity, about you idiot. It's a computer, of course you can. But that's how we got to 4,500 as a production run. And they were making them. Once we got it announced, they weren't making any except the 3 that we had for the show. But they started making them quickly.
Yeah, when the phone calls started coming in.
Very quickly.
When the interest exploded. Yeah, there's so many inflection points where things might have gone differently or...
Easily.
Yeah.
Easily.
It's amazing.
That's why I said this thing... It's changed the world, and I know Steve and I did it. I never said I did it. It was my idea to get in the computer market,
but it was his idea. Yeah,
it was his design, and so I said we did it together. And people ask me a question about it, and they say you had a major impact. And I said, yeah, I know, and I put my pants on one leg at a time.
Well, you know, when I told friends and family that I was, going to Radio Shack because they had this computer project, it was Radio Shack. It was kind of funny because it was a geek friendly store, but it wasn't. It was never.
It was never top quality.
No. It wasn't top quality. And in fact, the computer helped draw Radio Shack up for quite a while.
Absolutely.
I
probably kept them around a lot
yeah,
longer.
well,
as
and
a
it would have been interesting if Charles Tandy would have stayed alive.
Oh, I wish he
because
was.
it would have been completely different.
Oh yeah.
He had sort of a rough way of dealing with things, but he kept a very shallow structure. You're only like two people away.
No,
from your boss. It wasn't a big hierarchy of people. It was your boss and Mr. Tandy in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
And there might have been maybe two bosses between you and Mr. Tandy, but it was that shallow of a structure that, and he, if he didn't like something, there was no guessing about it.
You knew he didn't like it, right?
And Mr. I love John Roach to death, but he was more gentle than Mr. Tandy was, and
John was, yeah,
probably to the detriment of the company because people would make mistakes, and I quit twice for the same reason. The boss that was directly above me, and the third time. It was because Radio Shack marginalized the work I was working on. There used to be a website within Radio Shack's website called Steve's Workbench, and I see better versions of it now at places like Adafruit and other companies. The stuff that's being done on GitHub and anything that Arduino does is pretty good. Bunch of stuff that we missed opportunities on. So, but woulda, coulda, shoulda. I still have fun in the maker business, and we, my wife and I actually do STEM programs at the Dinosaur Resource Center in Woodland Park.
But the result of a simple thing, concept, that was trying to get a foot in the door, has been amazing. Because that's all the project board was to get a foot in the door.
Well, and it was very Wright Brotherish. Wright Brothers, two guys that they learned how to fly, right?
Yeah.
And the industry has grown up hugely from their initial stuff, but I don't believe they were ever as successful as the people that came on beyond them in the airplane industry. And so anyway, I'm glad to have been part of it.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you were working that day.
Yeah.
No,
a lot of happy accidents.
There were a lot of happy accidents in the whole thing. Absolutely true. And that when I met Steve immediately, I just knew we were going to hit it off. But I didn't know how much until I started talking with him, and we had a lot of discussions. And then when the clock issue, we both were on the same page and trying to do something.
Yeah,
and we've been on the same
all of a
page
sudden
all
we
the
lost
time.
the project, because we couldn't do the kit anymore,
right?
Which was actually the right answer. But at that point, then do you do a CPU and memory board and then have an add-on cassette board and then have an add-on keyboard?
If you're doing hobbyists, yes, but if you're doing what we were doing, no.
So the idea then was we got to do a finished product, and that kind of pushed a lot.
Plug it in, turn it on, it's ready to go.
An appliance, as you might call it.
Yeah.
The Radio Shack had writers for books and that. Forrest Mims, well-known writer. They didn't have anybody to write a manual. So I remembered my junior college business writing professor, who was also a computer professor, So I called him, Dave Leanne.
Oh, so that's how that happened, huh?
That's how it happened.
He did
I called
great
him,
job.
and he
with
jumped
that.
all over it, and
Yeah.
I made a multimillionaire out of him.
Yeah.
We've made a lot of multimillionaires, even billionaires.
Well, you know, and it's like at the show that we're at here in Springfield, Ohio, the Tandy Assembly show. You know, so many people come up and say, you know, because of you, I had a job. You know, or it changed my life direction.
I get you get them all the time, and actually, the first one happened for me before it was announced, but it was doing what we called our road shows with it. You're in a town and they set up an exhibit, people could come in and see it, because we didn't stock them in the stores at that point because they didn't have any. Right. And I was in one in Fort Worth. A gentleman walks up to me and says, "You Don?" Tag on you. Said Don French. And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Are you the one?" And I said, "I don't know."
What did I do?
I did the computer that you're talking about. He said, "Yeah." He said, "I want to thank you for it." And I said, "Oh, thank you." He said, "You don't know what happened. My daughter is autistic, and she was struggling. I bought the computer and wrote some software, and she's doing so much better." That made it all worthwhile for me.
Yeah.
I love kids. I have 5 kids, and I love kids.
Yeah, that would make you feel good.
And I hear it all the time, though. I heard it over and over again here of how they changed their career.
Yeah.
They did everything. That their life would be totally different if it hadn't been for this computer.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that people ask me what I'm proud about. That's the thing I'm proud about. I helped people. We helped people. We helped people change their career and be better.
Excellent. That's probably a great stopping point. I really appreciate the time from you guys today.
Well, thank you.
It's been a lot of fun to hear how you guys met and interacted and all that. And
most of it's true.
Yeah.
most of it. Yeah. I've signed more computers a day than I have in my life.
All right. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to give very special thanks out to Steve Leininger and Don French for their willingness to be interviewed together for this podcast. I thought it was really a lot of fun. I think they enjoyed it, and I know I certainly did. I provided links in the show notes for all the great websites we discussed during this podcast. Just go to floppydays.com for the full list. I very much encourage you to provide feedback for the show. You can do that in many ways. You can go to Apple Podcasts. You can do it from the website itself, the Floppy Days website. You can do it via email at floppydays@gmail.com, via Twitter at floppydays, on Mastodon at floppydays at oldbytes.space, on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/floppydays, or on the Discord server, whose link is at floppydays.com. Floppy Days is also available for streaming at TuneIn, Amazon Music, and Spotify, as well as the primary locations of the website, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Until the next show, pull out a vintage computer and compute as if it were yesterday. Bye.